I listened to a webinar that you did for the SSI meetup, and you talked about some interesting things around incentivizing issuance without paying the issuers. I thought that was really kind of fascinating, and wonder if you think that it's relevant to expand on that at all here.
Yeah, so I like talking about issuance because there's a lot of non-intuitive value that comes from re-enabling a user with their own identity. And this actually is sort of derived from the parable of UK open banking. So it was maybe, I don't know, easily over 5 years ago at this point. Um, Hopefully somewhere out in your listenership, like Simon Taylor, someone can pin me down on the exact date. But the point is, when all of the open banking regs were coming to pass in the UK, all of the banks were like quite bristled about it because they said, oh, by instituting data standards, all my customers are going to leave. And what came to pass is that very few customers actually left their home bank. In fact, it was maybe 1%. It was like very, very small. It was marginal. And the UK banks that most fully embraced the open banking standards around data interoperability, reuse, stuff like that, ended up with the highest TLV and NPS, or I'll spread to clarify, total lifetime value and net promoter score. So really what we learned is those banks that lean furthest into data sharing and reuse had kind of reaped the biggest rewards because they were the bundling accelerant that their users wanted to go do other things in their financial life that their home bank could not do. And so we take that parable and we said, hey, this same thing applies to SSI. If you can give an identity credential back to your users, it could be in Portabl, it could be Chase ID powered by Portabl, what have you. Say, hey, we also now have these downstream affiliates. You can go join these affiliates with your Chase ID and get XYZ bips on a portfolio or premium for 3 months or something like that. Why? Because the cost of re-originating someone using a credential based method from a trusted signer, it can be much, much cheaper. It creates economic surplus that you can then turn back into perks for retention, promotion, things like that. So there's kind of natural paths to saying, okay, what did we learn from open banking? How do you turn the knob on around to 11 and, you know, let it run, but on a verifiable credentials basis?
And how does that? Maybe we can close the loop on this. How does that benefit the original issuer? I understand maybe that there's perks that the user could get from other sources. Presumably, that builds some goodwill, I guess, with the original issuer. Is that kind of the idea, or is there more here to unpack?
It's goodwill, but there's also something that's called home account advantage. It's basically a stickiness factor. Like going back to the UK example, it's if your users are going to churn, just because there's new standards in place that is not going to stop them from churning. If you're not meeting their needs, they're going to go elsewhere, whether it takes a lot of effort or a little effort. However, if you can now empower them to do other stuff outside of the core services that you can already provide them, you've suddenly gotten super extra sticky. What that means is that you'll have less churn, and that kind of spirals out into goodwill, word of mouth, upselling and cross selling, things like that. That's the stuff that's kind of the first order effects of these identity powered experiences. Now, there's others, I think, in other parts of the SSID world, some of whom kind of model some of this stuff on tokenomics and some who don't, who think that like the issuer should be compensated. There are some potential ways where we can do that with like things like account credits, stuff like that. But say, I think it would be very difficult in the short term, at least, to try and set up infrastructure whereby Robinhood is like paying Chase for a credential. I think it's tricky. It introduces a complexity that is like potentially harmful to our sales cycle and is, I think, would raise a lot of eyebrows, to put it mildly.
Yeah, it's like when I've had these conversations with issuers, a lot of times they're like, it's just you're talking to the wrong. I mean, we're talking to the wrong person for that. I mean, we're not talking to the person in charge of coming up with new revenue line items for the company. So it's almost just a distraction from the job to be done for that individual. I mean, unless you're I mean, I'm not going to say that it's always a bad idea or anything like that, but it's often met with some kind of blank stares and some question marks above the the cartoonish question marks above the head sort of thing, right?
And now things may change in the medium term or the long term. I think if you look at, say, like Fifth Third Bank and Newline is a really good example where it's like a bank that started creating their own banking as a service that becomes a revenue generating stream for the bank. Cool. I think it's quite honestly too early to say whether banks will spin up their own like identity as a services based on Portabl or some other SSID provider, SSI type infrastructure that creates an obviously and directly monetizable product. It's too soon to say whether that's going to happen or not, or whether instead SSI becomes sort of the next phase of what banks and fintechs have done with, say, open banking connections.